Hello my dear brothers and sisters, the video I bring for you right now is video about the European countries and their capitals. But before I proceed, please try to follow my page and like this video, and you can still add it to your favorite in case you want to rewatch it. So come, let me show you. So the first country is known as Albania and its capital is known as Tirana. The next country is known as Andorra and its capital is known as Andorra la Vella. The next country is known as Armenia and its capital is known as Yerevan. The next country is known as Austria and its capital is known as Vienna. The next country is known as Azerbaijan and its capital is known as Baku. The next country is known as Belarus and its capital is known as Minsk. The next country is known as Belgium and its capital is known as Brussels. The next country is known as Bosnia and its capital is known as Sarajevo. The next country is known as Herzegovina and its capital is known as Sarajevo too. The next country is known as Bulgaria and its capital is known as Sofia. The next country is known as Croatia and its capital is known as Zagreb. The next country is known as Cyprus and its capital is known as Nicosia. The next country is known as Czech Republic and its capital is known as Prague. The next country is known as Denmark and its capital is known as Copenhagen. The next country is known as Estonia and its capital is known as Tallinn. The next country is known as Finland and its capital is known as Helsinki. The next country is known as France and its capital is known as Paris. The next country is known as Georgia and its capital is known as Tbilisi. The next country is known as Germany and its capital is known as Berlin. The next country is known as Greece and its capital is known as Athens. The next country is known as Hungary and its capital is known as Budapest. The next country is known as Iceland and its capital is known as Reykjavik. The next country is known as Ireland and its capital is known as Dublin. The next country is known as Italy and its capital is known as Rome. The next country is known as Kazakhstan and its capital is known as Astana. The next country is known as Latvia and its capital is known as Riga. The next country is known as Liechtenstein and its capital is known as Vaduz. The next country is known as Lithuania and its capital is known as Vilnius. The next country is known as Luxembourg and its capital is known as Luxembourg City. The next country is known as Malta and its capital is known as Valletta. The next country is known as Moldova and its capital is known as Chisinau. The next country is known as Monaco and its capital is known as Monaco. The next country is known as Montenegro and its capital is known as Podgorica. The next country is known as Netherlands and its capital is known as Amsterdam. The next country is known as North Macedonia and its capital is known as Skopje. The next country is known as Norway and its capital is known as Oslo. The next country is known as Poland and its capital is known as Warsaw. The next country is known as Portugal and its capital is known as Leipzig. The next country is known as Romania and its capital is known as Bucharest. The next country is known as Russia and its capital is known as Moscow. The next country is known as San Marino and its capital is known as San Marino. The next country is known as Serbia and its capital is known as Belgrade. The next country is known as Slovakia and its capital is known as Bratislava. The next country is known as Slovenia and its capital is known as Ljubljana. The next country is known as Spain and its capital is known as Madrid. The next country is known as Sweden and its capital is known as Stockholm. The next country is known as Switzerland and its capital is known as Bern. The next country is known as Turkey and its capital is known as Ankara. The next country is known as Ukraine and its capital is known as Kyiv. The next country is known as UK, which is United Kingdom, and its capital is known as London. The next country is known as Vatican City and its capital is known as Vatican City too.